I formally welcome you to Capital Mass's Focus on Funding Week. We are delighted to be able to have a week that we are literally handing over to nothing other than helping finding funds for churches and charities in this very challenging time. To introduce myself, I'm Tarn Bright and I am the interim CEO of Capital Mass. For those of you who aren't within the Anglican network, Capital Mass is the Church of England, Diocese of London's social action arm. So I do welcome you to this Focus on Funding coffee morning. Just to let you know as well that our guests this morning, Andrew and Mark, are both offering free clinics of half an hour each, as well as our wonderful Sarah Riley and Carol Ward, who are making themselves available post these webinars to support people to really get into some bespoke crafting of next steps for fundraising. So please email admin@capitalmass.org.uk or visit our website, Capital Mass, and we will be able to link you and book you into one of those clinics. So again, this is a shout out as well to the Diocese of London's fundraising department, headed by Sarah Riley and her wonderful team, including Carol Ward, for just being a wonderful resource and partnering with Capital Mass this week. I'm going to go now to our guests. We have with us today Andrew Clark and Mark Eriera. Hi guys. And Andrew Clark is from Apostle Charity Consulting. Before we move to Mark to do a brief intro, Andrew, would you regale us with the wonder of what it is you do?
I'll be delighted, Tarn. Good morning to everyone on the call. As you say, Tarn, my name is Andrew Clark and I'm the Managing Director of Apostle Charity Consulting. We're a fundraising, communications and graphic design consultancy. We're based in Chichester on the south coast, so about 90 minutes south of London. I've been a professional fundraiser now for over 12 years, and I would say at least 2/3 of our work is done with churches or Christian-related charities, and we're experts in trusts and foundations and major donor fundraising. Currently, we're working with 3 London-based churches on projects. Our main area of interest and expertise is predominantly in large capital appeals, so repairs, restorations, extensions, for example, but we do a lot of social outreach fundraising work also. In my spare time, I'm also one of the directors of Church Grants, which is an online catalogue of over 300 funding sources, both nationally and locally, relevant to the church and Christian charity sector. So if you haven't checked out churchgrants.co.uk, then do that this week. Personally, I've been going to church for over 35 years. I know I don't look that old, but it is true. I've been going to churches for over 35 years and currently a lay leader and trustee of my own church. So we are navigating, a lot like you, the current social and financial situation which we all find ourselves in currently, and delighted to be part of today's panel.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you for giving us your time as well. And it would seem to me that you are somebody really good to have as a friend. I'm going to hand now to Mark. Mark, would you please give us a short introduction of you and the organisation that you run?
Well, thanks, Tarn, and good morning, everybody. I'm a little bit older there than Andrew by a few decades. So I've been working for many years in the voluntary community sector and in local government. I worked in Islington and I worked in Tower Hamlets around homelessness in Tower Hamlets. I've worked quite extensively in East London, so Barking, Dagenham and Redbridge are areas that I know well. And I run a kind of a community interest company really called Civil Society Consulting. We had called it before Big Society Funding, but we just changed our name because Big Society seems to be in the bin of policy initiatives. So we've been running that for about 10 years and we really are interested in working at the front line and service delivering, particularly with groups that are very disadvantaged, working with very disadvantaged groups. But I also work, and I might just add in this, I also work 3 days a week as a consultant for the Church Urban Fund and Near Neighbours, which people, I hope, have heard of in terms of, you know, stimulating social action work.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mark. And again, thank you for giving us your time this morning. And with no further ado, I would like to now move into some of today's topics. And my first question, if we start with Andrew, and then Mark, if you anything else you'd like to contribute to that, I would like to ask Andrew, what changes have you seen in the fundraising landscape in the charitable and voluntary sector, certainly in the last couple of months since COVID has hit us? What are the changes?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very good question, Tarn. Just to maybe contextualize my answer. So I do a lot of work with Anglican churches, but I do a lot of work with Baptist churches and Christian rooted charities, but I also work a lot with secular charities as well. I think in terms of changes, for me, one of the most important things to say right at the offset is being online is absolutely key at the moment. Virtually everything being communicated about fundraising and how to access new funding is being done online. So try and be online and monitor the fundraising situation online as much as possible. That you can do. There's obviously been a large increase in online appeals. I'm sure you've seen those people donating online and senior people in organisations appealing to their fundraising community. And this has been done completely online. So keeping people engaged with your cause is becoming so important and so paramount when we're not able to kind of meet in person at the moment. I'm sure we all saw April last month, there was a massive injection of finance into COVID-19 response funds, which is great. It's very, very welcomed. So there's still lots of good opportunities to get funding for your social outreach work right now. In my discussions with funders, I would say they're almost exclusively wanting to know how COVID-19 has and will be affecting your organization over the next 3 to 6 months. So to understand that, it is really critical. So a key change to firstly understand how COVID has affected your organization, both in service delivery and in financial fundraising terms, and to clearly articulate this to funders is a really good starting point and a massive change. Most of the big funders, for example, Garfield Weston, the lottery, if you're kind of pro lottery funding, they're directing a lot of their funding towards COVID-19 responses. But those funding sources who have got very tightly defined grant-making priorities, for example, the Joseph Rank Trust, will continue to support churches in this time, and those funding sources will remain and keep grant-making defined by their original trust deed and grant-making priorities. What I'm hearing is, the good news is that grants are being turned around probably a lot more quicker, which is great in terms of us fundraisers. They're probably favouring higher risk organisations. So if you're working a lot with the elderly or food distribution, homelessness, domestic abuse, you will be in that kind of higher priority bracket and probably more likely to get funding from these COVID-19 response funds. So key changes for me, particularly responding quickly is beneficial. I think the Charities Aid Foundation, the Corona Emergency Fund, has something like 5,000 applications in the first 8 days of going live, and they had to pause it, which is a massive amount of applications. So being ready and being quick to respond is key. Look local as well. So your county voluntary service, I don't know if this is done on the London Borough sector, but I work in different counties. They've obviously all been given a chunk of money to distribute. So look local as well, and consider very carefully how and if you can increase your online presence and how you can communicate to your community online. For me, in terms of fundraising, have been kind of the key changes over the last kind of six weeks to 2 months.
Wow, that's content rich, Andrew. Thank you. A lot of stuff there. Just personally, we've got some bids in with the big lottery, and exactly as you've said, the speed at which they're moving is like something I've not seen before, having myself been in this sort of world for a couple of decades. So absolutely. Mark, do you have anything to contribute to where you see the landscape changing?
Yeah, thanks, Tarn. And as you say, Andrew covered quite a lot of the areas. I mean, I think in terms of the lottery, we've been helping lots of groups address, a 2-pager on what they're going to do in terms of being COVID sort of responsive and get into the lottery. I mean, I think we'll wait to see whether the lottery really is as quick as you've just indicated in terms of how it makes decisions. I think there has been a ratcheting up of energies from them, but I think the proof is in the eating on that one. I think really in terms of the fundraising landscape, and we've done a briefing about this, which we can share with everybody on it. I think it kind of divides into sort of long-term and short-term. And I think the funders have certainly, you know, there's a lot of social solidarity from the funders, isn't there, about, oh, we're going to help the sector and we're going to be very supportive. And there is this focus now, short term, and it's all 6 months. I think we keep seeing this 6 month come up. I was dealing with a trust yesterday and they're talking about 6 months. So I think it is about crisis support where the focus is. And I think one of the key issues for the sector in dealing with that funding landscape is how do they reconfigure what they're doing so it is COVID responsive, both short term with an eye on the medium to long term. And I think that's quite a tricky act. I think it's really quite difficult to do. And we've done 30 different surgeries so far with social action projects, both secular and faith-based, and people trying to really reconfigure their work to deal with some of the kind of frontline issues that Andrew's just touched on.
Yeah. And what do you think that this has taught us or exposed, Mark, in terms of how we have been previously fundraising? You know, what are some lessons there, perhaps, in terms of our current fundraising?
Well, I think that, I mean, I'm a bit of a grassroots boy here, you know, and I think that the grassroots sector, the smaller, medium-sized charities who immediately almost see organisational death, you know, in front of them. It's like fiscal cliffs, isn't it? You know, and you know, they haven't really got the reserves to push them through this. I think they're a bit, you know, sort of sharp to the act of what they need to do, because they've always been like that in a sense. You know, they've got to be quick on that. I think what we have noticed is some of the larger charities are quite clunky. Yeah, and I think they're struggling to respond, aren't they? Because, you know, and this is the issue, I think, short term and medium term. If you're not front line and you're not service delivery on kind of crisis issues, there isn't much space in this funding landscape for you, because it's all focused on that. And that seems to be what we're picking up quite a lot, you know, in that way, Tom. Yeah.
Actually, that's a really good point, Mark, because it would seem to me that obviously we are all in a position whereby we're wanting funds, as it were, to carry on that which we were doing before COVID, and yet so much of the funding streams now are around COVID response. Well, you know, in 3 months' time, not that there will ever be a normal again, there's some large orgs and our smaller ones as well. We can carry on doing, let's say, working with the, you know, sort of maybe the elderly or isolation clubs or whatever, which may or may not necessarily sort of fit into that sort of emergency sort of COVID funding availability. So what's your thoughts about the sort of current planning and also future planning?
Well, that's a tricky question. I think if you do the same old, it ain't going to get you very far right now. I just don't think it's going to work. So you're going to have to rely on your reserves quite significantly. You really are. And I think, you know, it's quite early days. I mean, it feels like we've been locked down for most of our lives, doesn't it? But it's still quite early days. We're on week 8, you know, so we're 2 months in formally into lockdown. So trying to think to the medium long term, I think still a struggle for the sector as I see it. And it depends how you see what we may be, you know, what's over the horizon. And that's quite a difficult act to get that right. You know, even if you're trying to do a bid for the lottery and say, oh, what are you going to do for the next 6 months? Well, you might know what you're going to do for the next 6 weeks because it's lockdown, but what will that social distancing mean to, you know, working with people with mental health problems or working with people with addictions, you know, in a few months' time? It's a very difficult act to follow. I mean, I do think there's a lot of sympathy here from the actual funders, and that is really encouraging. They kind of get it. I think we've got some really, this is a bit of a church urban hat on it, I think we've got some very intelligent funders out there, you know, who immediately kind of got together and made that statement through the London Funders Forum and things like that. So I think they're really aligned with the sector. But I mean, it's like the government says, they're not going to keep the whole sector going.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
we still, actually 2 months now, we still haven't seen any of that government money, really. I mean, they look like they're recannibalising it within government departments, if you look at the latest stuff on that. So that response hasn't even emerged, has it, 2 months on?
Yeah, very helpful. So Andrew, let me bring you into this. You know, we're talking here about, you know, ambiguity in terms of what we've run previously, and ambiguity in terms of what we might be delivering as churches and charities moving forward. What do you think some innovations are, Andrew, that we might have to work with or get on board with in order to be people who can work with an agility that perhaps we haven't had to before?
That's a good question. So I think for larger charities such as your Cancer Researchers, your NSPCC, your Age UK, who have previously had a very strong community or challenge event fundraising program, I think they're going to be turning their attention a lot more to trust and foundation options and the online appeal model, which I think is going to increase competition. I can't see major events like marathons returning anytime soon. So I think we are going to see those larger charities look elsewhere for funding where traditionally smaller charities may have been operating in. I think we will definitely see a ramping up of charities vying for our £2, £5 a month. So I think we're going to see a lot more and an increase in online appeals going forward. But I think in terms of, I don't want to say innovation because we should have been doing this anyway, but I think we need to become better at engaging with our current funding sources. So talking to them. So if I was working for a charity, I'll be calling up our regular major donors or grant making trust and explaining what we are doing and how we are responding in light of this crisis, because they funded you, so they do care. So they hopefully will keep supporting you in the future. So I think at the moment, in terms of a crisis, you have kind of two options. You are absolutely go for it in terms of fundraising right now, because there's lots of COVID-19 response funders out there. So if you are in need of funding, you can just crack on and do as much as you can or is appropriate. But if you're not in a financial crisis, maybe you still need to fundraise for a quarter or for a fifth of your current financial year and doing okay in kind of financial terms, then it might be an amazing time just to reflect and plan well for 2021. I think there's still loads of uncertainty how this is going to affect not only the UK but global economy. I think my longer term worries is the amount of money grant making trusts are going to have to distribute kind of beyond 2020 from their investments. But I mean, shameless plug now, I mean, church grants have created a brand new product called Kickstarter, which is helping churches in particular kind of plan well in terms of their fundraising options to the short to medium term. So if churches have a little bit of budget, then Kickstarter, we've created loads of really good pro formas and guides and plans to kind of help churches almost reflect and plan well over the short to medium term. But in terms of innovations, I think I banged on about it earlier. Being online is going to be absolutely key. Online fundraising in some way will just endure. And I think in terms of churches, how we communicate with our community, I mean, my church is doing absolutely everything online. Our Sunday morning service, our kids' work, our prayer meetings, the way we're communicating with our community is purely online. So that is going to have to be in existence definitely this year, if not beyond, in some format.
Yeah. Do you know what I've noticed, Andrew, is I'm sure, guys, we all have, that this crowdfunder sort of world has suddenly sort of just gone mad. You know, there's crowdfunders for somebody's front patio the other day that I saw, which, you know, make of that what you will. Now, in terms of Kickstarter, Andrew, is that a web link? How can we get our hands on that as a potential resource for churches, albeit with a fee associated with that? How do we get hold of that?
So if you go to churchgrants.co.uk, then there's a little link called Kickstarter on the left-hand side.
Okay.
I'm sure Trudy can paste a link on the chat. Oh, she has. Excellent. So efficient. And happy to have an initial conversation, obviously pro bono, just to assess if it's right for you. But if you've got a little bit of budget, obviously we work with churches on large projects for many months, if not years, and that is quite a substantial investment. But if you've got a small bit of budget and just need a bit of hand-holding or a bit of steering, then Kickstarter might be right for you.
Thank you so much. just to reiterate, just very briefly, that both Andrew and Mark, including Sarah and Carol, our internal fundraising team here at the Diocese of London, are offering their time free to offer clinics, 30-minute clinics, that you can email admin@capitalmass.org.uk or go to our website to book one of those. And our project lead on fundraising, Trudy, here at Capital Mass, will happily book you into one of those to get you started on your bespoke journey to finding the right places to go and how to commence that journey of finding new funds. So I continue now, therefore, and I just want to ask Mark, what do you think funders are going to be looking for that is different to what they have previously? Now, you have referred to that a little bit before, in terms of the fact that they're being nicer and kinder, if they're the right words. But how do you think we can really become attractive to them? What is it they're looking for from us that will mean that we get into the sort of front running on their funds?
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Tarn. I mean, I think, you know, Andrew makes some cracking points there about digital preparedness and communities, you know, digital communities and how we work around that. And I think funders are going to be really interested about the most imaginative ways that we can do that and how we can connect particularly socially excluded or socially marginalized groups around that. And that isn't just old people, you know, older people, which tends to get thrown in, but, you know, it's those people that are quite displaced by this crisis around homelessness or domestic abuse or refugees, asylum seekers. So I think there's going to be quite a focus on that. I think the positive side of this, and obviously I'm an optimist, but I am actually planning for, you know, permanent emergency going forward. And I think we need to be realistic about that. You know, whether we have an economic, well, the Chancellor said we will have an economic recession. I'd actually say we've got a political and social recession going on, which could get very, very severe with levels of unemployment for particular groups and in particular localities. And I don't know whether actually London is so badly hit on that, but I think there are other parts of the country where this could be very critical. But I think the funders will be very interested to see how we build on that kind of what I call the street response to this crisis, where people have come together. There has been kind of communal support networks, mutual support networks developing, which are quite exciting. You know, I've been part of it in my own community, although I'm not a bit of a community activist, as probably you can tell. But, you know, it seems to be a genuine kind of, you know, sense of solidarity from people on a street level, on a localism level, that we can really pick up on. And I think those charities that are kind of localized and specific and grounded and can articulate the views of local people, and they can evidence, you know, effective work, and that local people value them. I think they're in with a really, really good shout. That's why I'm saying the more, you know, the more remote, if I put it this way, you know, charities that I don't mean just second tier, but, you know, the bigger charities, they might struggle with this because they're not so street savvy. And I think there's some real energies that are bubbling up that we could all be party to. Yeah.
I think that's very, very wise. We at Capital Mass have been supporting a national endeavour called yourneighbour.org. And interesting to hear you say that, Mark, because one of the reasons we really put our sort of, you know, our weight, our muscle, if you like, to supporting that is because we realise that particularly some of the smaller charities and churches who are running social action particularly, that they're not going to be able to carry on in the same way in a singular capacity, in a solo capacity. And so with Your Neighbour, what part of what we're doing there is finding new partnerships, finding people to work with on the ground who we may not have known existed, but are doing really similar things, and finding new ways of doing things together. I just wondered, actually, Andrew, if you've got any sort of further insights for us in terms of partnership working therefore, and perhaps encouraging people where we haven't done before to go out and find people to bolster our bid with together. What's your thoughts, Andrew?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent viewpoint, to have. I think partnership work has always been important. I think it's always demonstrated to your community and funding agencies that the project or organisation in question is it's got good and wide appeal and support. I think going forward, creating meaningful partnerships or alliances, doing things together is a sensible approach, and one I think will potentially be seen as more fundable than not. Certainly in my discussion with funders, for asking how your individual project or idea or the services you deliver is complementing activities locally. So to have that local intelligence and knowing how you kind of plug a gap or how you're working in partnership or with others is really key. So if you're in a church, if you are a church, I would recommend even talking to your local authority, or in this case, your London Borough, and asking just the kind of open question, how as a church or as a church community can we serve those around us? Now, we will have a pretty good understanding and idea of how we could do that, but actually asking the funder agency, how could we help you help others? And that's been a really important question. I certainly have asked that from our church down in Chichester, how we can support Chichester District Council in terms of our local Chichester City activism, and we're starting to be involved in that process. So partnership working, definitely explore it with your existing ones, but just asking around the kind of Christian charity or secular world, how can we work together is definitely a good and sensible approach. I would strongly advocate it at all times.
Yeah, wonderful. Because not least as well, there's been some statistics that have been banded around. How accurate they are, guys, I don't know, but just that there's an expectation that there will be a 30% reduction in smaller charities simply because they won't be able to sustain themselves. And so to align ourselves with either another church, another group, as you say, some local authority, strategy teams, could well be something that would, God willing, prevent there to be that level of reduction in what oftentimes are some of the most grassroots of social action, is that smaller charity, that church that's just there for its community at a very real and messy level. So I just want to take this opportunity just to advise those within the Diocese of London, and apologies for those of us from Manchester. I will see if I can't find some links for you in the Manchester region, but just to let you guys know that by emailing parishfundingsupport@london.anglican.org, there are actually some church grants that are available, which oftentimes we find people know nothing about. And so within the Diocese of London, do go to that church grant facility. It might be a real bonus for you to do that. So, okay, as in our last sort of 10 minutes or so together, what I want to look at really now is the practicalities now of fundraising in an environment that's unclear. Let's start with you, Mark. How would you propose those who maybe have not had to go and seek different types of funding before? What should they do? Start Googling, filling out forms? Or how would you propose someone sits down to do a project plan on this?
Yeah, thanks, Tarn. I mean, I will share our briefing on that, because we're really keen to point people in the right directions, and obviously lots of resources around funders, and we did this briefing looking at funders in response to COVID and what they were saying. So we've looked at 50 of them, and it is a changing feast, as you may know, because things are being kind of launched or changed by the day. And I'd like to touch on one of those things at some point in this discussion. But I think, it is about how you articulate what your project, your need is, and how you're responding to that need, what the costings are, who you're involved, and maybe getting a 2-pager. And I've been working with about 5 or 6 different groups across the country, and they're not. There's only one in London actually, that's in Greenwich. But trying to articulate their need, because they're not doing that as well as they ought. Or a church group in Coventry, for example, who's doing emergency food aid essentially and medicines to their older community members. Again, not good at articulating their policy, their proposal, and not having a safeguarding kind of policy idea, which the lottery have just asked them for. So trying to sort of collate things into, you know, a sensible proposal that they can take forward for a range of funders is a really, really good point, a good starting point. So we spend quite a bit of time on that. I mean, they're particularly vulnerable, fragile voluntary sector groups, but it is about articulating what you're doing, how you're responding to this, how you're doing something different, numbers of beneficiaries, and a good budget, and something that makes sense, and not being too greedy about that. You know, I mean, the lottery is saying, you know, we're only funding things, as you know, for 6 months. We're funding up to £100,000, but that's top end. You know, they're thinking of 20, 30, 40,000 pounds that would make a difference to immediate emergency, you know, crisis interventions. So I think really put that head on, and try and obviously get some of the money that you need to keep your organisation going in the context of that, because funders, I think, believe and understand that. I mean, the last point I think that we haven't touched on this, but it is a sadness, because I think the government's done pretty well if you're an employee of a charity and you're furloughed, well, at least until October, or if you're self-employed like me, it's been incredibly generous. It's been sort of throwing money out, which we'll be paying for a long time. But in terms of the government, this Office for Civil Society, it's been pitiful, hasn't it? You know, so, you know, we've not got that help from the government into communities that we need to get into communities. And I think we should all be really pushing government and members of parliament to make that happen, because that's really, really required to scale up what's needed. Because however good your proposal, you know, if you put it into Charity Aid Foundation, I think that was oversubscribed by 8 times. Yeah, I mean, they you know, started with 5 million, they got 40 odd million pounds worth of bids. So, you know, even with a good proposal and, you know, sorting everything out as an organisation, you're up against phenomenal odds on that. So we do need more money to be available in this crisis. And to give people hope and motivation in that context is quite important.
Thanks, Mark. Andrew, have you got anything to add to that, just in terms of sort of, if you like, that public purse, as it were? Oh.
So in terms of what funding is kind of coming down from the top, from government, you mean?
Yeah.
I think the advice I've been given to my charities, similar to how Mark's already alluded to, you're up against it. Every charity is now doing this, and they're really ramping up their efforts. So I think having a crystallized understanding of how the COVID situation has affected you, understanding what new costs you are and will be incurring. I mean, this has come out of completely nowhere, this situation we find ourselves in, and the government, churches, everyone are just quickly responding. So I think the kind of funders are saying, what do you need now? What do you need now to kind of get through this initial kind of crisis moment? Looking ahead, as Mark rightly says, beyond that is still up in the air and a lot of unknown. So I think having a crystallized understanding of how you're being affected now, what do you need to survive now, is a really important first step.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. And both Andrew and Mark will be available to book time with on a pro bono clinic, as we have referenced. One of the things, guys, that is becoming very clear to me is that the business plans that we might have had in place, assuming we had one for our church or charity in terms of our fundraising strategy, we're going to have to revisit those business plans. Because, as you've said right at the beginning, things are going to be different anyway, and we need to develop a new skill set as to how to write our outputs and outcomes in light of a whole different way of delivering our services, just social distancing for one as an example there. So just again, to really encourage you to sign up to a clinic so that you can draw down on these gentlemen's skill sets, as well as with the Diocese of London's fundraising team, so that you can tackle your very own bespoke scenario. Thank you so much for that. I just think that it's an interesting thing to note as well around this working with local authorities. It's perhaps something that some of us haven't done before. We've stayed within our own sort of niche or sector or community, and we haven't gone to work with our local authority in a meaningful way. YourNeighbour.org are currently in the process of developing a toolkit to how to help churches specifically work with their local authorities, not just for funding, but also just in terms of helping make sure that the deliverables of the local authority are also therefore being met through that of the local church and charity. So we will have that posted on the Capital Mass website as soon as we can. I'd like to go to some questions now. A question from Fee. Let me just, actually Fee, instead of me reading it out, why don't you unmute, Fee, and just ask a direct question, keeping it as brief as you feel is relevant. Thank you, Fee.
It was just a comment really. It was based on, I think, what Mark had said, that for myself, I'm in a parish setting, the largest social housing estate in Hounslow in our parish. But a lot of what we've done is been relational, walking alongside people through difficulties. So there's often there's not one issue, whereas if you're going to a funder, you kind of say, well, we're looking at this particular issue, we're looking at a range of things and then trying to see how we can connect people into support, but we have that relationship with people on the ground. But that's not something you can easily package into a funding bid. It's not a neat item to speak. So I was just wondering if there's, if they've come across anything like that, or one could look at potentially getting funding for a role that is being that coordinator.
Andrew?
Does that make sense?
Sorry to jump in, Mark, before responding, but just to say that I'm helping a homeless charity in Reading, and they're from a Christian kind of faith basis, and they got only a small handful of beneficiaries. I think they help maybe 8 people in 2 houses, and they do a lot of one-to-one support with key workers, and obviously key workers can't go in to the houses for safety reasons, so they're having to actually talk with the tenants through a window or even from a car, and their kind of work they're having to do because of the risk homeless people potentially going back to alcohol and drugs or going back to street has really ramped up. They're having to increase their contact with their tenants by 300%. So those costs are going up, and the need is going up in a time when funding is becoming more competitive. So I've certainly been applying to relevant trusts and foundations or other sources for those kind of roles, those kind of key worker roles. And I think that's a totally valid and justifiable expense as long as you can clearly articulate it and talk about the need and impact this virus is having on the beneficiaries that you work with.
Mark, anything to add to that in terms of fees specifics?
Yeah, I mean, I've been working a lot on those sorts of projects, if I'm honest, around how communities, whether it be in Liverpool, Middlesbrough or Manchester right now, around social connection, how you build on that relational work and how you deliver it. And I can see the struggle that there is, and a lot of your community members might not. You were saying on your comments, I think, Fee, about not having access to smartphones and things like that, but the things that can be done. So I think, we're urging people just to write that down, and we're helping them to then, plan that and scope that out. I think that, and I am saying this to a number of people, I think that really though, if we're saying, right, we can deliver this additional support work based on a history of, being there on the ground and doing the doing, which is fantastic. Then to say, well, we're going to appoint somebody. Sorry, you're talking about a coordinator. I think that's really difficult. And I'm saying it's like normal rules don't apply. I mean, if you were applying for funding previously, you say, oh, well, we're going to go to open recruitment, blah, blah, blah. But I think you've almost got to have somebody in mind who can get into that role so that you can argue that within a funding bid, the urgency of the issue, that you can get that additional support in there as quickly as possible. Because I think if you start talking about new staff, I was talking to colleagues in Manchester about this, new staff, well, how quick is that going to be to get somebody in there to do some work in North East Manchester? It kind of it undermines the urgency of your response in a sense, because you're almost building in delay, if that makes sense. But we can help on proposals, and that's kind of what we do. Yeah.
Great. Wonderful. Fee, I suggest you press into these the skill sets of these two gentlemen, and let's get some funding in for you. I'm just looking at a point that Trudy has made, in as much as that people are using up reserves very quickly, both churches and charities. Yet we're also aware that funders are, or typically have been reticent to fund those who don't have a robust reserve in place. Maybe, Andrew, if we could just go to you first. Mark, if you've got anything to add to that, just follow on after Andrew.
I've not had loads of steer input from funders regarding the reserves issue. I think they're highly expecting that a lot of organisations will have to go into it and want to understand some sort of fundraising strategy to kind of build those up again. But every charity should have a reserves policy in place to try and stick to that as much as possible. But I personally haven't heard much feedback from funders directly on this point. I don't know if Mark's had much input from that.
Oh, sorry, hello. Am I back? Yeah. So I think the issue of reserves is quite a nuanced one, isn't it? I mean, the research from, say, the Liverpool City region, which is 11 local authorities, some of the poorest in the country, would show that 60% of charities have reserves of less than 3 months. And they constitute 90% of the employers in terms of employing people within the charitable sector in that area. So you've got a really vulnerable community voluntary sector there, where reserves have always been an issue, and they're a big issue now. I think you could make that. I think you can make that sort of potentially weak point that you've got, you know, financially as a strong point right now in terms of your emergency. If you've got a good project, a good plan, and you can really get on with delivering that, I think that the reserves issue, you know, you can say, look, this is going fast. And we need to, and that's why I'm saying, in some of these emergency bids, you've got to put in something for the core, because you need your organisation to be able to flourish, to deliver emergency crisis intervention. So I think it's kind of a strength, but clearly, you know, as this crisis continues, and people maybe aren't getting this funding through because it simply hasn't arrived from central government or what have you, then yeah, I think these charities will fall over, and that's a real dilemma, you know, going forward, I think.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And just to note, everybody, that Mark has put a link there to the briefing that he has talked about previously to help equip churches and charities to get sort of some ducks in a row, as it were. We will make that available on our website as well, for those of you who won't have watching this at a later stage. You won't have that link up there. So we will make Mark's funding briefing available on the Capital Mass website. In our final moments together, do just be thinking about any questions you've got that we could happily put to our panel in the last 5 minutes. But I just want to make you aware of tomorrow's webinar, the webinar of Capital Mass in conjunction with the London Diocese Fund My Church team. We are focusing tomorrow a seminar specifically on emergency funds for individuals. One organisation that we're going to be talking to is Acts 435, and they are an organisation, they like to call themselves the Vicar's Discretionary Fund, which I got rather excited about when they shared it with me. She said, Tarn, instead of vicars worrying, or leaders or charity leaders worrying about how to get Matthew down the road, who's really struggling with no money and struggling to get benefits, hasn't got a new mattress for his children, or a washing machine that's broken down. Acts 435 are the organisation that have set up a scheme whereby donors can meet those individual needs at a rapid rate. So I encourage, if not you, for you to share tomorrow's webinar details with those in your community who want to know how to access small, granted, funds, but those that are perfect to meet very individual needs for those who are really vulnerable and challenged right now. So local partners, Bunmi, do you want to just come off mute? And this will probably be our last question, unless there's a corker that comes on into the chat. Bunmi, unmute yourself and just ask us the question directly. Thank you, Bunmi.
Thank you. I just wondered how feasible it is, given the current distancing measures, for us to be able to put together credible bids with local partners.
Okay, if we go to you first, Andrew, and then Mark, and anyone who's got a last question while they are answering, please do type it. Thank you.
Well, definitely in an ideal world, it's always best to meet people face to face, and that's how you build meaningful and long-term relationships. But I would say most people have a phone, most people are online. Zoom is become ingrained in our souls. I've been having dozens of Zoom calls every week. And so communicating and building relationships definitely in this time is being done still remotely and by other means. So in terms of creating viable partnerships, it's still viable, and I would encourage you to start chatting to people, to your local partners, finding how this has affected them. How can we work together? How can we jointly come together and solve solutions? Meeting each other in kind of a virtual community and solving problems, I think is definitely how charities and churches can and should be responding over the short to medium term. So go for it.
Mark, anything to add there, just in terms of social distancing and partnership development?
Yeah, I mean, I think as a natural kind of collectivist person, I would say in normal terms, yeah, absolutely, Bunny, this is what we're kind of looking for as an approach within the sector. You know, it's about solidarity, it's about working together. I think it's easier to do that if you've got pre-existing kind of possibilities around partnership, you know, and that you can then ignite them and energize them through phone calls and through this medium. I don't know whether trying to start something fresh through this medium right now is a good use of time. I've tried it on a couple of things, and I think people struggle with that. I think they really struggle with this. I mean, this is still kind of newish ways of working. Okay, it might become the new norm, but I mean, it's still new. So I think people are struggling with those partnerships. But and this is where I get so cross with the central government response on this, because it seems to be requiring people to do that, because, you know, it's something that's been launched this week, which is a loneliness fund. I don't know if people have looked at that. You know, it's a kind of government throw it in the air and see how it goes sort of fund of £5 million. And they're saying, I kid you not, during this crisis, they're saying they want to give grants out of no less than 500,000. Now that then requires, doesn't it? It requires. Wow. I know. I mean, you look at that scheme, you know, and this is about dealing with loneliness in the COVID times. Yeah, you couldn't get more stupid madcap than this scheme. I was looking at, because they want you to spend 80% of the grant that they hopefully going to give out in July by the end of October of this year. So if the minimum grant is 500,000, you've got to spend 400,000 of it by October. It's completely madcap. And you could say, going back to Bunny's, oh, let's get a nice partnership bid together of all these voluntary groups that are doing good stuff at a local level. But it would be a horrendously difficult job to do that. The closing date is Friday week. Do you know what I mean? It's like madness. So I'm not sure if I'm giving much that's helpful to Bunny on this. But, you know, I think if you've got those pre-existing partnerships, do build on them. But I think if you're trying to get them from square to respond to things like the loneliness fund, forget it. You know, it's not a good use of your time.
Well, thank you. And actually, I'm actually very grateful for your skepticism. I think it helps really craft well for us expectations. Fee, is that a hand up, or were you just, yeah?
It was. I was just wondering, can intermediary organisations apply for that grant and then, you know, then attract other applications? Like Capital Mass, for instance. They're
looking at some national coordination. So I think it would be like Age UK, Mind. But I suspect, and even at Church Urban Fund, I'm looking at this right now as part of my work, my non-consultant work. But I mean, but trying to then really get these partnerships that make sense, you know, that make sense in Hounslow or Ilford or what, you know, that takes a bit of time. You know, so to suddenly announce a small scheme, a little bit of money, and the window of opening for this was 2 weeks. You know, they announced it at the beginning of the week and it closes Friday on the 29th of May. I mean, it's just not helpful to the voluntary community sector at all. And, you know, we were promised, as you know, £750 million. Well, none of that is arriving. And half of it, we don't even know at this current time, half of it, we don't even know vaguely how it's going to arrive, you know? And that's a huge shame in terms of the sector response, because we are well into this crisis now, not to have that information.
Thanks, Mark. Great questions there. Thank you so much. I'm just going to ask for a 30-second summary of some of her interesting information on behalf of the Diocese of London. Sarah Riley, could you just give us just 30 seconds? You've just put some good comments to me on the chat. Just bring to the table, as it were, what you've just shared.
I was just mentioning a couple of things, and firstly that you know, sort of to echo what Mark's been saying about a lot of these emergency funds and new pots of money that have been springing up have been very quick to close. So lots of them have closed already, but you know, others may still be opening and giving you a week or two to apply. So it is worth, at the diocese, we're trying to keep the fundraising information. Carol's already shared the link. I'm sure it'll be shared again. We're keeping that as up to date as we can with new information about closing dates and when things open. So do keep checking back. It is a good list of potential funders. And the other thing I was just mentioning to Tarn was just sort of other things, and this is a bit based on my experience of supporting my local church. So outside of looking at trusts and foundations, ways to engage with your local community. So there's lots of sort of WhatsApp groups on streets springing up left, right and centre. That might be a good place to sort of encourage people coming together. I know we have a lady on our street who's collecting for our local food bank. She puts a box at the end of her drive and collects it and is our sort of nominated representative for the street. So I think there's a lot of willingness in the community for people to come together and help, and I think it's a good thing to bear in mind for churches, that you can potentially tap into that outpouring of goodwill. But just on a practical note as well, make sure your gift aid is claimed and up to date. We've got a backlog at my local church, and I've got the weekend ahead of me to get through probably what will be £10,000 in gift aid that just nobody has got around to claiming yet. So I'd encourage people to sort of think creatively and think differently about where some of those bits of money might come from, as well as charitable trusts.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, our time has come to an end, and so on behalf of Capital Mass and Fund My Church at the Diocese of London, we would like to thank you for being with us, and we hope that something of what has been shared today will support you and support you into ensuring that you are doing what you are really called to do. And we will do everything we can to try and support you in that endeavour. Please do go to the capitalmass.org.uk website and register on for tomorrow if you would like to hear more about how you can help attract some emergency funds for individuals. And there's also a programme running for the rest of the week as well on other funding possibilities. But it leaves me with the great honour of thanking Andrew and Mark for their wisdom and their expertise. We are grateful, and we recognise that you are both positioned for such a time as this, because we are in need of your help moving forward. So again, please do book into a free clinic with the individuals that we have referenced. We would love to support you on this moving forward.